Okay, we're live again. And if I am sideways, we're going to have to actually go vertical. That was not expected. It could be that in the last update of the software here for Pages Manager, they might be forcing us to go to vertical whether we like it or not. So, still sideways. Okay, then that settles it. We're going to have to do this the hard way, folks. I didn't expect this. I am going to need to do this as a vertical broadcast today, which does not suit me, but we'll just have to do. See if we can get a balance on this. I have to hold this thing, which is not intended. Okay, let's start. Even though, hi, from New Mexico, Roberto. Are we looking good now, everybody? I need a current notion of whether we are correct. Hi, Gwen. Are we vertical? Is it, Charles, is it still sideways? It's good, okay, because I'm vertical. It looks like they modified the software so I can't do a theatrically wide broadcast. Vertical works, so it looks normal except for the fact that I'm vertical today, which will suit some of you guys because that means that I will probably be able to read the entire question when you ask a longer one. And I'm sorry for that because I cannot put this guy on the tripod because it's not set to use something like this. All right, well, let's go with what we have. This is Martin Selbrede, and it is March 11th, 2018, and this is Chalcedon Q&A, some meat of the word. And we have these every week with the intention of sharing answers to questions that are posed by folks who are looking to get a little bit deeper into the Word of God. We have 3 questioners who posted questions on Ask Chalcedon, that is ask.chalcedon at chalcedon.edu, and we're going to handle those first. And then we'll get to the questions, the live questions. First one. By Helene Janane, she asked, what is the difference between Dr. North's and Dr. Rushdoony's thinking on the matter of tithing? I made reference this last week to the fact that the two do have a strong disagreement. It's kind of almost evident in the titles of the books that they wrote. There's Tithing and Dominion by Rushdoony and Powell, and then there's Tithing in the Church by Dr. North. And North's position in that 1994 book is that the church is due the entire tithe. There is not one scrap of it should go anywhere but the local church. And this, of course, is very much different than what Dr. Rushdoony argues in the book Tithing and Dominion. Radically different. Where it's kingdom-oriented. So you have a difference between an ecclesiocentric orientation and an basiliocentric, kingdom-oriented orientation. So that is the major difference. Dr. North then wrote a larger book in 2011 called The Covenantal Tithe, where he puts more of the same material together. And it looks like it's going to be necessary to confront some of this material at greater depth, greater length. So we plan to do exactly that, to explain our differences. Now, technically, if you look at a book like The Covenantal Tithe by Dr. North and look at some of these key passages that relate to the question of the tithe in Nehemiah 10 and Numbers 18, he will quote them but not comment on them. And those are key verses that need to be commented on because they deal directly with the question, what is this whole notion of a tithe of the tithe going to the priests, from the Levites to the sons of Aaron? That is the big question. And until that is opened up and dealt with properly, we don't know, we're not actually grappling with those texts. So you can find those texts in the index of Dr. North's book, but they're not grappled with. And that, of course, is the crux of the problem. They need to be grappled with. And so we're going to actually have to go into greater length and point by point go over these books by Dr. North and show where we differ. Now, we've already published 3 articles by Dr. Robert Fugate on the question of the civil poll tax of Exodus, and also contradicting what Dr. North had to say. That's where we have iron sharpening iron. Both positions come to the fore, and they are in a position then to confront one another on the merits of the biblical case. So, the second point that was raised by Helene, it was that She says, I made a distinction between individual and group justice and pointed out that the Bible only knows of individual justice, but not group justice. And she said, is there a biblical justification for this? Well, the fact of the matter is that every aspect of justice in the Old Testament, where the law of God is applied to individuals, never to groups. There's one exception, and Dr. Rishnuni draws attention to it, and it's not a matter of group justice so much as it is group responsibility. And this has to do when there is a murder that occurs on the border of two different towns, and both towns, therefore, have responsibility, community responsibility, to deal with the fact that there's an unresolved murder between the two towns. But community responsibility is not the same thing as group justice. So you can take a look at Dr. Rishnuni's comments on that particular passage. And then I think she also asks, how does this notion of individual justice square with God visiting the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation? And she also cites Matthew 27:25, passage where the Jews, after calling for the blood of Christ, say, his blood be on us and on our children. Does this not mean that there is, in fact, group culpability, group liability, if you will, for those who are not yet born? The proper passage of Scripture to look at for this question is the 18th chapter of Ezekiel, where this entire question is dealt with at length. It begins with Ezekiel talking about a proverb, speaking for God here, being a prophet. The word of the Lord said unto me, what mean ye that ye use this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge? As I live, saith the Lord of hosts. By the way, that's an oath. When God says, as I live, it's an oath in his own name. Ye shall not have occasion any more to use this proverb in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. And then he goes into a big, long exposition that extends all the way to the 19th and 20th verses, where we read this. Yet say ye, why doth not the Son bear the iniquity of the Father? When the Son hath done that which is lawful and right, and hath kept all my statutes, and surely hath done them, then he shall surely live. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. So individual justice is what the Scripture talks about, and therefore Ezekiel, expounding on the law of God, is laying it out. Now, this didn't mean that the idea of group justice and generational guilt wasn't in fact propagated in Israel, because there's a proverb circulating, as if it was Solomonic, which it's not, a proverb circulating in Israel to the effect, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. And they claim to be the children. It says, we're suffering because of our father's sin. And God says, no, you're suffering because of your own sins. Different thing. So, individual justice there. Okay, let's see here. Ralph Yoder asks, do you consider yourself a partial preterist or a full preterist, and how do you see the end times playing out? So when we talk about preterism in the first place, here's the deal. If you're going to say you're a full preterist, that means that every single prophecy in the Scriptures have already been fulfilled. There's nothing future. Everything was fulfilled by approximately 70 AD during the Vespasianic War. And this is regarded correctly, in my view, as a heretical position, and that all these prophecies, there's nothing left to be looked forward to in the future. And what we have now will continue on forever, at least till the heat death of the universe, I suppose, because it becomes to the point where so much Scripture has to be dealt with improperly to make that happen. Not to mention that you always actually have to peel back to the Apostles' Creed and declare that to be false already. So there's a whole host of issues with the full preterist position, sometimes called the Hymenaean heresy, and has been dealt with at length by quite a few folks, particularly partial preterists. Partial preterists don't like the idea that their position is hijacked and then run to what they regard as an absurd extreme that conflicts with Scripture. So there's a distinction between a partial preterist, which says some prophecies of the Old Testament and the New have been fulfilled, and others remain to be fulfilled. So here's the other deal. Normally when you say, hey, I am a partial preterist, you're really talking about the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, the revelation of Jesus Christ, the last book of the Bible, number 27 in the New Testament, the 66th book and of the whole Bible, and usually you're talking about that when you say I'm a partial preterist. So in respect to the book of Revelation, I am not a partial preterist. nor a full preterist, and was known as an idealist. Dr. Rushton was an idealist. Warfield was an idealist. Hengstenberg was an idealist. There are quite a few folks who believe that the prophecies of Revelation fit between the two Advents and span a large gap of time, 20 centuries already in running for the prophecies in the book. So that's a very different point of view than, say, the partial preterist position, which takes all the prophecies of Revelation, by and large, and treats them as happening in the 1st century A.D. A futurist believes that none of it's happened yet. It has yet to happen, but when it does, they believe it'll happen in a very short span of time. The historicist and the idealist believe it takes a long span of time, which we're still in the middle of, and the historicist believes it's relatively chronological in sequence, and the idealist says, no, it's not chronological in sequence, and we have reasons for that. We're not going to go into big analysis of the book of Revelation here right now, but it was one of the very first books that I did a Bible study on back in 1980-81. So, from an idealist perspective, and it has a lot of weight. Oh, Dr. Hengstenberg's work, Charles asked, what Hengstenberg's work do you recommend on the subject of idealism? Well, he has a very decent commentary on the book of Revelation. It's a 2-volume, and it's been republished by Width and Stock, so you can get a pretty decent copy of it from them. It looks still a photolithograph from the original edition from the 19th century. Nonetheless, it's all there, and it's pretty decent up until the 19th chapter of Revelation. Falls apart at the 20th and beyond. But for the first 19 chapters of Revelation, it's one of the best commentaries out there. Insofar as that it finds all the Old Testament reference, referents, plural of a referent, all the what he calls fundamental passages in the Old Testament that John is writing on. The reason that Hengstenberg can bring this stuff up for us to discuss, is because he is one of the great Old Testament scholars of all time. So when he comes at the book of Revelation, he comes at it with Old Testament eyes and is able to unpack it for us. And that's what makes it a very powerful proposition when we read through Hengstenberg. Doesn't mean he's perfect, doesn't mean he's infallible, but it does mean that his is an important source to grapple with in understanding, say, the idealist perspective of the book of Revelation. William Lee is another one who is a considered idealist, and Lee and Hengstenberg were 2 of the 6 commentaries in Revelation that Warfield thought came closest to the truth, as he said. And so that would be a good place to start. Now, let's also deal with this. Preterism, partial preterism. Folks are also preterists with other passages. See? For example, the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, partial preterists. I happen to be a partial preterist with Matthew 24 and most of Matthew 25. I believe it's been fulfilled up to Matthew 25, verse 30. I don't believe that Jesus switches gears to the far future until Matthew 25:31, when he sees the white throne and him who sat upon it, and all the nations gathered before him. That is the final judgment. So everything prior to that point, I would place pre-70 A.D. So certain partial preterists only go so far as Matthew 24:34, and they say at that point Jesus transitions in verse 35 to the future, and I would disagree with them. In other words, when it comes to Matthew, I'm more preterist than a partial preterist could be, who might take all of Revelation as past, you see. So it's not cut and dry. The bottom line is it's not cut and dry. I personally think we need to take every passage as it stands written and weigh it, and look at the cross-references, in particular the ones in Luke, which in my view are decisive in saying that we did not preterize or set things in the past properly with Olivet Discourse when we split at verse 34 of the 24th chapter. We need to actually move the dividing line a whole chapter farther forward. And then we have the coincidence of Revelation 20:11 and 10:11 with Matthew 25:31. So, also, we can take certain passages as preterist. For example, the man of sin, I would say, was fulfilled in the 1st century. That prophecy in 2 Thessalonians 2 would have been fulfilled in the last century. We look at other passages where John Owen would say, well, this passage, I think he was looking at 2 Peter 3, was fulfilled in the past. That doesn't mean he denies a future judgment or anything like that. He just simply says that particular picture that Peter was depicting there referred to the downfall of the Hebrew system. Now here's what happens, unfortunately, when full preterists take a look at some of these things, they'll say, well, look, we have John Owen on our side with this verse, and we have so-and-so on our side with that verse. Boom, 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 therefore our position is correct. Well, no, because each of the individuals that they are citing are not full preterists and deny it and hold it to be heretical. It's just that on individual verses there is some division. Doesn't mean that they all line up with the full preterist position. Simple as that. Okay. So the second question was, how do I see the end times playing out? Well, I think Warfield hit it right. And there are more scriptures that, if taken literally, teach the complete conversion of the entire world to the last man standing there are anything else eschatologically out there. So that's the position I take, that the Great Commission will actually be fulfilled, and we will not be called home until there are no more enemies except death to be destroyed. The Great Commission will be fulfilled. The darkness will pass away until the true light is shining, and the true light shines until it broadens into the fullness of day. And so that's what we are seeing in Scripture. Every family of the earth shall be blessed. Every nation, the family, every tribe, every tongue shall call the name of the Lord. This is the whole point of the new covenant, when you look at it, is that no man shall need to teach his neighbor, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know the Lord, from the least to the greatest. There's no more opportunity for the Great Commission to be fulfilled. And God has put his law on the hearts and minds of all at that point. Doug Gates asked, what about a final apostasy? That is a doctrine that I regard as superfluous and, in fact, not supported in the Scriptures. Dr. Rushdoony and I went roundabout on this in the early 80s. He said, actually, there's only two passages that support it. One is the Man of Sin passage in 2 Thessalonians, which Warfield already had decisively shown was the Roman emperor of the period. And then there's this passage in Revelation 20, verse 7, 8, and 9, which is understood with a bald reading, if you will, a literal reading of these symbols. Literal reading of symbols is a bad idea in general, because you're dealing with the symbols and not the things symbolized. That's the last place to look for a final apostasy, is Revelation 27, 8, and 9. And so the most symbolic chapter, the most symbolic book in the Bible, barring maybe Zechariah 14, is now held up as the keystone of an entire doctrine. We always recalcitrate and get upset, rightly so, when premillennialists will build the doctrine of a millennium out of 9 verses or 6 verses of Revelation 20. But we build our doctrine of final apostasy out of half as much stuff. And it's because we don't understand the passage. This is where we need to take a look at the work of Milligan, Kleefoth, Diesterdiek, Warfield on the topic of the final apostasy. It turns out in the book of Revelation, that notion of a little season, microchronon, occurs 3 times in the book, in chapter 6, chapter 12, and Revelation 20. And our position is that the meaning of this symbol is the same in all 3 places. And so it doesn't fluctuate. God's not a God of confusion here. And so you can take the notion of the microchronon in Revelation 6, 9 to 11, and apply it to Revelation 20. In fact, there's every reason to apply it because you have something very similar. You have disembodied souls in both places. And that's where we need to go. We need to explain that. So what actually happens, I'll do a thumbnail sketch here, which is not going to do justice to my version of Revelation 20, but it's what we're going to have to go by. What's happening is that there are 2 different realities being depicted in the book in Revelation 20. One is on the earthbound side, and one is on the heavenly side. And so the writer, symbols contrast the difference between being with the Lord as a disembodied soul. And by the way, he said, I saw the souls of them. He didn't say he saw them. He said, I saw the souls of them. So it's disembodied souls enthroned. These are disembodied because we read in Revelation 3:21 that those who are faithful unto death will sit with Christ in his throne. So they are not with us anymore. They are departed. Those are the souls. So what happens is that you enter, if you will, the peace of the millennium when you die. It's a vision of the intermediate state. The soul, after it leaves the body, enters the intermediate state, and that's depicted by a peace. You are no longer around Satan. Satan cannot attack you. There was a time, by the way, if you were in heaven, that Satan could attack you. He's present in heaven in Job 1. criticizing and accusing Job, attacking him, skin for skin, et cetera, accusing Job right in front of God. And in Zechariah 3:1, he's accusing Joshua the high priest. The accuser of the brethren was there in heaven, but he was cast out, and he's no longer in a position to accuse. So it is a Satan-free zone. And so what actually happens doesn't happen to Satan, but happens to the saints. The saints are secured from Satan's attacks. Satan is cast out of heaven, and this is why he's so upset in Revelation 12:12. He has great wrath because he knows his time is short. Now, what that really means is he has the little season. That's all he has. He can only deal with people living on the earth. He can no longer attack disembodied souls, the souls of saints in heaven, as he would have had opportunity to do in Job 1 and Zechariah 3. In the New Testament era, after Christ ascends, he casts Satan out of heaven. So he can only walk on the earth. So his time is limited, and his dominion, if you will, is limited to the earth. So the picture there is kind of contrasts or goes with what Paul says. He says, I don't consider the present troubles worthy to be compared to the exceeding weight of glory to come. So he says, our present troubles are a little thing, but the exceeding weight of glory to come is a massive thing. It's a wonderful thing. And so this notion between temporary troubles that are minor correspond to a little season. And in fact, this is what happens in Revelation 6, verse 9, 10, 11. The souls of them beheaded by Christ, they cry out, how long, O Lord? And it was given them white linen robes, and they were told to wait a little season, microchronon. They must wait for the little season during which their brethren run their course. That's what the point of that is. That word there, based on the pleroma, the word pleroma, plerosothai, that means that their brethren must also run their race. They must therefore finish their little seasons, in other words. So the little season is the time that all of us have. It's a short vapor is what the psalmist calls it, right? We are living the little season right now. And a little season simply means time on earth. The millennium, or the 1,000 years, represents your time in heaven, what it's like. 1,000 years of peace compared to the time of trouble on earth, time of war. It's the difference between the church triumphant in heaven and the church militant on earth. And so these are contrasted with the two different symbols, the symbol of a little season and the symbol of the millennium. And as Warfield points out, when using time symbols, the way to illustrate exteriority, outwardness, something outside of the piece, is before and after, right? So if you're in this little passage here, the way that you need to show that you're outside of it is either before or after. And so that's why Satan is depicted as active before and after, which simply means outside of the realm of the disembodied saints in heaven who are with the Lord. See, the Lord's army gets stronger when his saints die. They join him on his throne and rule with him. They can judge angels by name, in fact, at that point, kind of fulfilling what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6. It's not the same for Satan's army. When his people die, his army, if you will, he gets weaker and weaker, and his dominion is taken away. So there's a lot of stuff going on here in the book of Revelation. But the upshot is that you are living right now in the period of time depicted in Revelation 20, verse 7 to 9. And what's happening in that period of time? According to the Bible, fire from heaven is coming down and destroying all those who are wicked. Now you might say, well, Martin, we don't see any such fire, do we? Well, take a quick look at some of the passages, say in 2 Chronicles 34, I think it's verse 36 or something like that. It says, great is the rage of the Lord that's poured down upon us. That word rage is in Hebrew the glowing fire of the Lord that is being poured out upon us. There was no literal fire of the Lord, but it was God's wrath. And that's what Paul says in Romans 1:18. He says, for the wrath of the Lord, wrath of God, is being revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness. It's being poured out upon us. It's in fact, the throne vision of Daniel 7 is exactly that. I saw a throne and him who sat upon it, and a stream of fire pouring down on the earth from him. That's a continual thing. In Revelation 5:2, we see, when they look down from the throne of God to the earth, they see a sea of glass filled with fire. So fire simply is God's judgment in action. That's what we see. And consequently, what's happening in Revelation 27, 8, and 9 is in compacted form the entire book of Revelation in one picture, that God's fire comes down and destroys the wicked. By the way, that's not very much different than what John the Baptist said. He shall baptize you with fire and the Holy Spirit. And what's the purpose of the fire? To purge, to destroy all that's wicked and evil. So it's not as if there's a final apostasy, it's that you're living in that period right now. And it is not a rebellion so much as it's simply God's providential government. There is a direct connection between Romans 1:18 and Revelation 20:7, 8, and 9. The fire that's being poured out that destroys the wicked is pouring out right now, has been poured out for 20 centuries, will continue to pour out until the wicked are gone, and no place can be found for them. Read Psalm 37, where David says, I diligently considered the place of the wicked, but could not find him. They are ultimately expunged. They are removed. The meek inherit the earth, and the wicked are removed by the wrath of God. Now, the wrath of God can be worked various different ways when you think about it, right? How is it that God cuts off the posterity of the wicked? It's done providentially in many cases, but it also can be done by judgment. Both these things are coming into play. The upshot is that the world is being purged of the wicked over time and prepared for the righteous, so that the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous. Okay. So there is no final apostasy. That actual verse that is appealed to in Revelation, you're living in it now, and it's not so much final as stretched out between a long period of time. That's why when people say, well, it's supposed to be like a final hour, isn't that pretty short? Well, according to John, you're living in the final hour. That's the reality. We live in the final hour now. And so it's a short time from our point of view here on earth, again, remember, little season, microchronon, but once we get to heaven, we see it from a different point of view. We enjoy it, the fruits of the peace that Christ has bought for us up there, which will eventually redound to the world below when the purging finishes off. If you look at Isaiah 4, verses 4 and 5, we read that God will purge the earth completely and purify it. And that process also is ongoing. These are not things that we have to wait for, because Christ is enthroned, and therefore God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness, not some. And where's it coming from? Where's it revealed from? From heaven. It's pouring out from heaven. Great is the glowing fire of the Lord that's being poured out upon us in 2 Chronicles 34. So, all that to say, a lot of pieces there to put together. But it doesn't mean that there's any basis for a final apostasy. And quite a few scholars who knew their Bibles reject the idea of a final apostasy. It's not just Warfield or Rushton, who later on in his life, who also rejected it. You can go back to folks like Robert Haldane in his commentary on Romans 11. He makes it very clear that what you will have at the end of that period of time promised is a complete conversion of all the Gentiles and then the complete conversion of the remaining Jews. So you have a worldwide salvation and nothing short of that. This is also taught by H.A.W. Meyer, the great 19th century German exegete of the Greek New Testament. Exact same exposition. He points out that the only reasons to object to this view are dogmatic ones. So you have the dogmatic tail wagging the exegetical dog. So, in fact, this is so true that Lenski said only an exegete would think that the prophecy speaks about the conversion of all the Gentiles and all the Jews. Bingo! It's exegetically sound, and so Lenski attacked it as an exegetical conclusion, and he wanted to push his dogma of everyone knows there's going to be a final apostasy. Everyone knows things are going to go from bad to worse and hell in a handbasket. But that position is not scriptural, because exegesis shows something very, very different. Even Lenski gave that hint. Okay. Gwen Saunders had asked a question. Please address the topic of ecclesiastical courts. This is a wonderful question. I wish I had a wonderful answer for it. How are they supposed to work? Are they the same thing as a local spiritual council, or are they more than that? Well, the point is, it depends on content of what passes for justice for an ecclesiastical court. Nowadays, ecclesiastical courts are very little interested in the law of God, but very much interested in church law. Consequently, they can become very tyrannical because the essence of liberty is in God's law, not in church law, or canon law that can often go astray as well. So if the ecclesiastical court is premised on the law of God, thank you, Paul, if it's premised on the law of God, then we're probably in a much safer place if they're handling all the data according to God's laws. We're going to be much closer to biblical justice, which, by the way, is never perfect this side of the final judgment. Simply because it's a fallen world and we don't have perfect eyewitnesses and evidentiary proceedings. Nonetheless, That's the justice that God gives us and holds us to observe all that he has commanded us concerning these things. So in ecclesiastical court, they were doing well in the 1st and 2nd centuries. In fact, so well that in the Romans, pagan Romans, were resorting to the Christian courts for resolution of their civil disputes, because they knew they would get justice from the Christian courts that they could not get from the Roman courts, which were corrupt, subject to bribery and things of this order. Whereas the Christians were going to rule for the Lord, and they were going to judge for God and do it right. They feared God and said, therefore, we can't mess around. We cannot play favorites. There can be no respect of persons. Justice must be impartial and impartially applied according to God's laws. So an ecclesiastical court, as constituted in the first couple of centuries, they feared God, they respected the law of God, and they applied it, and the world saw to it, and the world went after it. Now, it'd be a big mistake to go to a church court in about 99% of the cases. It's very rare to find a church court actually operating properly. And now I have news in my own state of these ecclesiastical proceedings that are getting ugly that make no sense to me. And here's the other issue is, what's the court of appeal? And at a certain point, if a church says, well, you must now agree with our judgment, they speak to all the other churches roundabout, and all the other Christians say, you may not reevaluate our case. It's sealed. In other words, it is infallible. So the claim of infallibility on ecclesiastical court is one of the most dangerous sources of tyranny that we have today. Where God looks for justice, behold injustice and wickedness, with people on a Sunday morning wearing suits. It just staggers the imagination that this is the case. So let's take a look at the 1% case, where it's a really good ecclesiastical court that follows God's law. It fears God, and respects the law of God, and applies it fearlessly and with compassion. That court, is that the same thing as a local spiritual council, or is it more than that? It can be either. That's the point. It doesn't have a specific shape. It doesn't have an institutional framework that you can say it fits the box. Rather, it is known by its deeds. Where justice is, that's where the gate of the Lord is, and that's where justice is delivered to his people through faithfulness. So we have to look beyond the institutional component to say, is it a valid court in God's eyes? Then it doesn't matter if it's a home church that did it. If they delivered biblical justice, God is honored, and God will honor the verdict of that court, and will also sanction those providentially who defy the verdict of that court. It's the other way around, and the other 99% of the church courts out there that do not deliver justice. So that's a tragedy. Here's a question, another recent question. Is the penalty for an unsuccessful murder attempt the same as actual murder? Follow-up, what about a failed suicide attempt? Okay, so that's a very, very interesting question, because we don't have an actual murder, we have an attempted murder, which was, what's the word I would use? It failed for one or the other reason. And the honest answer is, I'd have to double check on this. If I don't know the answer, I will say so. And so these are interesting ethical quandaries, and the Word of God certainly does speak to this, and so I'm going to go ahead and verify that, and we will answer this next week when I actually have something solid behind me to deal with that question. If it's an important question, I'm not going to mess around and guess. It's a disservice to you, and God's not going to like it either. So no guessing allowed. We'll go ahead and deal with that question next week and see what we can say about it at that point, because it's too important. Yes. And Charles made a point to let Becky know that all of us have Joe in our prayers. Again, I apologize for the shakiness of the image, but this machine would not fit in my tripod vertically, and so I have to hold it in my right hand. So what I need is Aaron and her to hold up my hand and keep it strong and solid and stable. Gwen, you're very welcome. I'm glad to be able to answer that. I wish we had better ecclesiastical courts. In a theonomic renaissance, there would be a recovery of the ecclesiastical courts, and people would go there. Right now, as bad as the civil state courts are, you will get better justice from them than an ecclesiastical court on average. And that doesn't speak well for the Christians, does it? It's a disaster. It's a moral disaster, and it's a disaster that's predictable when you throw God's law under the bus. It's that simple. Okay. By the way, the reason I had a rather inappropriate chuckle when he asked about a failed suicide attempt was the penalty for a failed suicide attempt. Would that be capital punishment? See, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You're going to help them finish the job that they couldn't do. So again, that's why that struck me as an internally incoherent event, if you will. So, yet it is a form of self-murder, is it not? So we'll try to deal with that question next time. Again, we try to study a whole bunch of things, and that doesn't mean that we have everything covered. And I marveled how many times Dr. Rushton, someone would pose a question that you might have thought he would have known the answer to, and he'll say, "I do not know." And he would just leave it at that, because he knew what his limits were, and that's very, very wise, instead of to guess. Okay, here we have a question from Charles Roberts, one of my fellow warriors, and I appreciate what he's been doing with the question behind the question broadcasts. In a world progressing toward the nations becoming Christ's disciples, are denominational differences important? They serve an important function because they are a test of character. They test our character. They give us an opportunity to be organically united when in fact we are not yet doctrinally united. We are going to have that situation come only when that verse in Isaiah 52:8 is fulfilled. And so God is not going to deliver doctrinal unity first. He's going to expect organic unity between the brethren, and then we will have the blessing down through the future of working out all these details and getting it nailed down. And I believe finally probably the denominational differences will soften. They will become more regional than anything else. So that's the likelihood. We will solve the problem of Beto baptism versus credo baptism. We will solve all these issues that divide the brothers. But first, we have division between the brothers to be solved on a different level. And therefore, I think God's going to use the denominational differences as a testing bit of character for us. And that's why I appreciated the way Warfield dealt with his Baptist brother, Augustus Strong, in a article that I commended to everyone last week, which Ground Control put on a link for, The Polemics of Infant Baptism. And it's remarkable how Dr. Rushton ended that article, where he obviously took sharp but respectful issue with Strong's credo Baptist position. And he says, "We do regard them as mistaken, and they regard us as mistaken, but we should not therefore withhold the right hand of fellowship." So it's interesting to see how he handles that at the tail end. Ironically, which is peaceably, you can disagree in an agreeable way. Sure, both sides see that there's something very important at stake. No one is saying there isn't something important at stake. But equally important at stake is the relationship between the brothers. The family of Christ is not to be at war with itself. Okay. The siege. Chalcedon Foundation. Are some sins more grievous in God's eyes when a society endorses them? That's an interesting point. When a society endorses a sin, now we have that problem in Exodus about following the multitude to do evil. At that point, the multitude is in sync, and it creates a societal expectation. It gives everyone a pass. So we have to look at a passage like in Hebrews 11, when Moses refused the the treasures of Egypt, and thought that the reproaches of Christ were of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. We have to spurn these things. And so he did, and we need to do the same. That's there in the 11th chapter of Hebrews for a reason, as an example for us how to conduct ourselves when society does, in fact, endorse this sin. And one of the reasons that perhaps it endorses the sin is that the church is silent in confronting society on it. And the sounds of the church is deafening, as they say, in so many cases. Now, the church is starting to wake up. It's a sleeping giant, but once it wakes up, it can be very effective. Dr. Rushton would always comment on how the Puritans, being such a small sector of society, both in England and in America, yet were the dominant factor. They were 10% or less of the culture, and yet they dominated the culture because it was a a committed minority who stood unconditionally on their faith, to quote Dr. Rushdoony. So too we need to be in the same boat now. Now, does this mean that certain sins are more grievous in God's eyes? I think it grieves God that we've now compounded the sin, say the sin X, and all of society is doing sin X, and you as a Christian decide, I'm going to follow the multitude. So now you actually have two sins when you think about it. You are committing sin X, and now also you violated the rule that said don't follow a multitude to do an evil. So you've compounded your sin as a result. But the original sin had the exact same gravity, if you want to call it that, as it always had. It's simply compounded because you excused it because everyone else is doing it. And in God's eyes, this is the worst reason to do anything, because everyone does it. Very good. Roberto, thank you for your kind words. Again, my apologies for the shaky transmission. We can't use the tripod today because our application is forcing us to go vertical, and my tripod cannot handle an iPhone vertical, so I have to hold it with my right hand and my left hand. So I'll hold it as steady as I can. Okay, please talk about the book you will be covering next time in the Book of the Month Club, Cure of Souls and Why It's So Important. So the Cure of Souls, which will be discussed on the first Monday of March, and I'll be working with Andrea Schwartz on that particular broadcast, and we invite everyone to sign up for that if you haven't, because it's free, and we delve into the book. It's a very important book by Dr. Rushdoony. It was published posthumously, but that didn't make it any less important, because there's a doctrine of confession in Scripture, and it's not the Roman Catholic one. And what happens with model Christians, Protestants in particular, evangelicals, is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We say, well, confession, Roman Catholic, out it goes. We don't have anything like that in our church or our home. Well, the fact of the matter is, you ought to. You ought to be confessing Christ, just for openers. And there's a whole notion of what the cure of souls is. The pastors were responsible, if you will, and had the task given to them to aid those souls who were hurting, suffering, and in need, and where there's a world of hurt that needed their wounds bound up, spiritually, emotionally, etc. And all this comes to part to play. So counseling is at the core of the book, among other things, and all the catastrophes in counseling. Dr. Rushdoony had his hands full with counseling, and he certainly had to pick up the pieces with other folks doing terrible counseling. And a lot of the book is a litany of the disasters that happen when non-biblical approaches are applied to counseling. In fact, probably the worst thing of all is pietism. Pietism and a false sense of forgiveness, where you don't have true forgiveness based on the work of Christ. Rather, you have false forgiveness. You have what Jeremiah calls healing the wound of my people slightly. Peace, peace where there is no peace, the Freudian notions. But mostly because churches are antinomian, we have solutions to problems that worsen the catastrophe that is inflicted on those who are already injured. Remember, the prophecy about the Messiah in Isaiah 42, quoted in Matthew 12, is that he shall not quench the smoking flax or bruise or break the bruised reed. In other words, he's very gentle in dealing with those who are wounded, any kind of wound. And we need to follow this exact same example. The Lord did it that way. That's our calling. That's our example. And so the Cure of Souls deals with the question of Christian counseling and the proper way to apply it. So there's a whole bunch of what not to do's in the book, by example. He doesn't name names, but the cases are so tragic you weep to read. And then what we ought to do, because it's for our spiritual health that we get past that. So it's a very unusual book. You sit to see Dr. Rushdoony as a Christian counselor, biblical counselor in this book, which is a unique way of looking at what he had to say. So I look forward to leading that Book of the Month Club discussion. It's a book that I keep lending out and never getting back. So apparently it's very popular for those who borrow books from me and keep them. So I had to actually acquire a new copy just to refresh myself for the upcoming Book of the Month Club broadcast. So it's a good one. Yes, it's April 9th. Oh, that's correct. We had a problem with April 2nd. I forget what it was, but yes. Which is funny because I looked at the latest Chalcedon report proofs, and it talks about the first Monday of the month, so obviously it is mistaken. But it only starts with May 2018, so maybe it's not mistaken. Maybe it's true for May following. Okay, Charles asks, Can you say a few words about the flack you have received in standing up for Dr. Kishore? Well, that's interesting. I myself have not received this kind of flack personally, but some have. We've received, I think it was Hal Shurtleff, received an anonymous letter written to him, 2 pages, advising him that he needs as quickly as possible to disassociate himself from Dr. Kishore, not use him at any more of his Camp Constitution conferences, that Dr. Kishore is all in it for the money, and he is a terrible, evil person, a narcissistic personality type who rings everyone into his circle and bamboozles them, etc., etc. He says, and all he's going to do is drain you of your cash. To which Hal Shurtleff wrote a very, very strong letter back saying, ironically, Dr. Kishore donates all his time to Camp Constitution, is one of our most effective speakers, and has helped me sacrificially at his own expense the entire time I've known him. So, with just a few short words, the attack on Dr. Kishore's character was stifled and put in its place. But the fact that these letters are being sent anonymously is a concern. We've had similar letters, attacks on Dr. Kishore, anonymous letters, slipped under the door of the clinic in New Hampshire that was opened recently using his work and his model. So, yeah, there's continual attacks, fiery darts of the devil, and we simply have to quench them one at a time. Interestingly enough, Hal Shurtleff did not hesitate to say, you can take a look at how many people support Dr. Kishore who are in the medical profession here at the link to the movie, heroinamerica.com. And, of course, we have retired professors from the Boston Medical School and Harvard Medical School, things like this, who's still active. The man said there's not a single doctor who supports Dr. Kishore's work, and we know very different. We got them all on film. So it's very easy to controvert these false claims against Dr. Kishore. These attacks are premised on one's ignorance and one's gullibility, credulity, our willingness to believe something because it's negative. And since we know the truth, it's very easy for us to counter them. But it doesn't mean that those same kinds of attacks are ineffective elsewhere if you don't know any better. Jessica Lynn Weber-Long writes, can you expound on the role of the wife in regards to instructing a husband when the wife is better educated in a specific area? What are your thoughts on Timothy 2:12? But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence in this area. So, I believe that as a counselor, the wife is to privately work with the husband and give him her best at all times. We see this in the case of Sarah and Abraham. God even told Abraham, hearken unto the voice of thy wife, Sarai. Don't work off Sarai or Sarah at that point. Her name changed as did Abram to Abraham. But in any case, the point is that God commanded it. And Rushton said, very few sermons are done on that text. Tells you something, because men have a love to have the preeminence in all things, just like Diotrephes in the books of the epistles of John. But here we have texts that show there's another side to things. Now, as far as that question, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence in this area. I always recommend a particular article by James B. Hurley, Did God Command Women to Wear Veils and to Be Silent in the Church? It was published in the Westminster Theological Journal about 1977 or so. And if you send me this request by messenger, I will probably tomorrow be able to send you the PDF by return as an attachment to it. It's a very important text in many respects, and it deals with this question, I think, in probably one of the best ways out there. Also deals with the question of veils, if you are interested in that part. But more to the point, it does deal with the question of the teaching authority and the prophesying and all these questions about silence in church, and I think in a very exegetically sound way. So that would be, I would supply that to you, and then you could read it at your leisure. Turns out, since these Q&As have started, I probably have sent it out to 4 or 5 different individuals as a result of these Q&As. A lot of people get a benefit out of that. Hurley is one of the experts in the area of men and women in Scripture. In fact, I believe he has a book similar to that title, Men and Women in Biblical Perspective, I think is the name of the title. little bit dated today, but the point that I'm making is that the article he wrote for the Journal in '77 has a lot of weight and still is worth pursuing. There we go, the documentary filmmaker Joaquin Fernandez. There's a link there for that. Dustin, welcome. Glad to have you here. Roberto wrote, a lot of cowards write and have multiple Facebook profiles around these parts, sir. Well, what can I say to that? I actually have written on this topic. Men behind masks. Newsweek had an article about this. You know, if you look at all these terrorists, what are they wearing? A big mask around so their face, so you can't see who they are. And one of my friends here, a reconstructionist attorney, calls it sock puppetry. You're wearing a sock puppet on your hand and making the sock puppet talk for you. And it's unfortunate that we have that, but we do. And it's a sign of the times that people prefer to be anonymous when they're dropping bombs or trolling, etc., etc. So far, we have not had any trolls willing to sit through my pedantic banter. I guess it's self-policing in that respect, folks. It's good to be boring. So, that leaves the trolls aside. Any other comments at this point? I do not know what time we have, but I know that we have 15 live viewers at the moment, and that we're vertical and a little shaky because I have to hold the phone by hand. I hope that answered the question about the Cure of Souls Book of the Month Club. April 9th, not April 2nd, which is good because April 2nd, I think my twins turned 31 years old. We'll be celebrating. 7 minutes left. Okay, we can certainly fill that with a bunch of fire and brimstone, folks. Any final questions for our final 7 minutes? People sending me the smiling, laughing gifts. By the way, there's an interesting thing about folks that operate anonymously. There may possibly be a basis for that in a very evil time, where you might operate anonymously until it's safe to work openly. But that's not the reason most people on Facebook operate anonymously. They do so to cover their sins. Okay, Dustin, just got on, not sure what you talked about regarding the documentary, but how did you get interested in that topic? Interestingly enough, it was pointed out to me, we had done a Chalcedon conference in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Paul Jaley, we had lunch with him, and at the event he said, you need to meet this Dr. Kishore guy, and he told us a little bit about the story. And the very next day, Dr. Kishore joined us for Paul Jaley's tour of the capital of Massachusetts, and I got to speak with him. And I apparently got enough of his confidence that I wasn't just some joker, which I could easily be, to then bring his big notebook showing what the case was and what had happened to him. And I was very sympathetic, and I said, well, we could certainly look at publishing this material. And the next step was that I would then visit him, and that date that happened is reflected in the very first article, where I had to fly in to the adjacent state, and he had to drive up very close, and he got close enough to the border that his the ankle bracelet that they have him wear with the GPS on it said, hey, you're awfully close, you're trying to escape Massachusetts. So it's an interesting event how that occurred. So Dr. Paul Jaley was the one who put me, in essence, in touch with Dr. Kishore. And Dr. Jaley had seen the success of Dr. Kishore's work in the Plymouth area, and therefore it's not without cause that Dr. Jaley appears in the video Hero in America. I was interviewed for it, as was the police chief of Plymouth. So important stuff going on in Plymouth. It's a disaster, and they have some of the worst parts of the disaster in Plymouth. Therefore, it was on Pastor Jaley's heart that Dr. Kishore had been taken out of commission, and in such an evil way by the Commonwealth. So that's how I got interested in it. Someone put it in front of me, providentially, and then I ran with it. When we started the process, I didn't think we might but do 1 or 2 articles. We ended up with 18 in a row. Boom. Hey there, Jay. 18 articles in a row, and then we'll follow up with the book and the movie and see what comes of it. Be in prayer about the movie. If you care to support the work, it is still in post-production and worthwhile project. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but the last week, Time Magazine had an entire issue devoted to the opioid diaries. It was a series, it's a photo essay by Mr. Nachtwey, I think James Nachtwey. And so the entire issue of Time Magazine was devoted to opioid crisis, putting a human face on the disaster, the tragedy of it. Another significant thing about that issue of Time Magazine, you might recognize that name Nachtwey if you've seen any of the previews for Hero in America. His brother appears in the movie. His brother was Dr. Kishore's realtor and knew Dr. Kishore very well, and spoke to about Kishore's impact on Massachusetts. So there's a connection with the photojournalist for Time Magazine. We have his brother on camera in the movie. Let's see. Oh, yes, thank you, Charles. Not everyone might know who Hal Shurtleff is. Hal Shurtleff is a big, long supporter of, a longtime supporter for Chalcedon, a longtime friend of certainly Sam Blumenfeld, and Sam Blumenfeld pretty much bequeathed most of his library to Hal, who's been very faithful in supporting the work of Blumenfeld in Massachusetts. As you know, Hal also was in Massachusetts. I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple times. And he's a very good man, and he's very, very busy about the Lord's work in Massachusetts. Hold him up in prayer if you might. And he does operate the campconstitution.net there. And Dr. Kishore is often present at those Camp Constitution events, which promote liberty in the civil realm. So I think, are we pretty close to concluding, Jay? Interestingly enough, I had a question about preterism earlier in the discussion. It would have been fun if you'd been here for that. We could have had a fun back and forth. Jay has written a very interesting commentary on the book of Daniel from a preterist perspective. In the Days of Those Kings is the name. It's a massively documented work, and I'll be providing a recommendation for it. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree with the entire book, but I think this kind of scholarship is critical and important and needs to get out there so that we had the best possible case for each eschatological position. Jay, of course, is a post-millennialist, but he's also a partial preterist with Revelation, and in this case, the book of Daniel, and makes a very strong case, what's called an inductive case, for it based on external evidence. Therefore, he makes a big, fat, juicy target for someone who would want to contradict him, starting with futurists, our common target, if you will. Okay, and then Chalcedon writes, yes, have folks check out the links below on your articles and how to help support the film. Yeah, if you can, a little bit goes a long way in post-production, trust me. And sooner is better because we don't want to delay the film. We'd like to get it out sooner because of the nature of the tragedy that continues to mount in our nation. Who would have thought that Christian Reconstructionists would have something to say about this and something decisive to say about the question of drug addiction and have a societal solution for it? And yet that is the case because we uphold the biblical standard of sobriety and how to get there using the proper mechanisms. So, how are we doing on time, ground control? Ground control. Aha, that tells me what we're going to do. All right, I'll appreciate you all being here. Dr. Kishore is a Christian. Yes, he was even raised as such. There's been a lot of influences in his lives, but he has certainly aligned himself with the Christian faith. And he has had his supporters in the Christian faith for a long time. And when things counted, those were the ones who stood by him. So we'll see you all next week. God bless. We'll catch you up with you, and we'll hopefully solve these technical problems with this vertical vision that we were having to put up with today. Talk to you then. God bless.